Catholic Education Sandhurst acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Hello and welcome to Magnify Matters, a podcast proudly produced by Catholic Education Sandhurst. What happens when we combine evidence-informed practice, high-quality coaching, and specific models for reference? You get transformation at scale. In this episode of Magnify Matters, host Tim Edwards sits down with educator, author, and podcast host Ollie Lovell, now Director of StepLab Australia, a powerful platform helping teachers embed better practice every day. StepLab is one of the key partners of Magnify Sandhurst, supporting over 120 teachers and leaders in our first wave of professional development. Together, Tim and Ollie explore how instructional coaching, aligned teaching techniques, and a deep understanding of how learning works can transform teacher development, not by doing more, but by doing what matters most. In this episode, we explore how Ollie turned his passion for education research into a globally recognised podcast, what makes StepLab different from typical professional development, why instructional coaching leads to lasting teacher-led change, the science behind StepLab's model, how the partnership is helping to build sustainable, system-wide improvement in Catholic Education Sandhurst, and what it really means to empower teachers, not just support them. Whether you're in a classroom, leading a team, or shaping education strategy, this conversation offers practical insight into the future of professional learning, one deliberate step at a time. Now stay with us as we magnify what truly matters.
Ollie Lovell, Director of StepLab Australia, thanks so much for joining a very early episode of Magnify Matters.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
It's a great pleasure to have you, as it is to have the StepLab crew as a partner of Magnify Sandhurst. So just give us a bit of an intro about who is Ollie Lovell, where does he come from, and the forming years to be an educator.
Thanks, Tim. I'm not used to answering these kinds of questions, so I might need a bit of poking and prodding to say enough. But yeah, Ollie Lovell, born and raised in Tassie. I was in Tassie. I did my undergrad there as well. I went to a school, a faith-based school as well, called the Friends School, which is actually a Quaker school, and that got me very interested in Quakerism, and I now do call myself a Quaker. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do when I left school, so I kind of had a gap year and explored the world a little bit, and it was only on the plane back from Sydney to Hobart at the very end of my gap year that I decided what I was going to do at uni. I told myself I've spent a whole year exploring the world, trying to work out what I want to do. I haven't decided yet, so I'm going to decide on this plane trip. And I sat down next to a bloke and I said, "Hey mate, what do you do?" He said, "I'm a physicist." I said, "Great, I'm going to study physics at uni." That was something I'd been considering beforehand, but I kind of took that as a sign. So yeah, then I talked to the careers counsellor. She said, "Have you thought about a combined degree?" And I said, "Sure." So I did economics and physics. Really enjoyed that. And then I got into education because in my second year of uni, I ended up with a role running peer-assisted study sessions, which is kind of like tutorials run by second years to first years. And I just realized I really enjoyed that. And so it was from there that I kind of pursued education and ended up coming up to Melbourne to do the MTeach at Melbourne Uni. And I guess the rest is history.
So Ollie, you've arrived in Melbourne, you've finished your MTeach. Where to first? In the coalface of the classroom?
Yeah, so I got a job at a school in the western suburbs of Melbourne. I really, really enjoyed that time, particularly initially. I had the opportunity to teach VCAL maths and quickly got promoted to head of senior maths. It was in my second year, actually, which was due to a few movements of staff. Often, these kind of opportunities come up. So I was teaching physics, further maths, now general maths, bit of maths methods, and just really, really enjoyed it, really sunk my teeth in. And had some great colleagues there. I stayed there for 5 years. I would say I started my podcast in the second year of that job, and that provided me with exposure to like so many phenomenal ideas about education that I was able to imply both in my classroom and throughout the senior maths department. But I didn't feel like the rest of the school was quite heading in the same direction, and I felt like I was butting my head up against a few things. And it actually got to a point that I thought about leaving the profession in about my fourth year or so.
What is it that prompts a second year out teacher say, "Oh no, I'm going to start up a podcast"? How did you go about that? What was the need?
Yeah, great question. Well, so remember this is close to a decade ago now. So it was actually, podcasts are everywhere now. We're doing one right now. But 10 years ago, they weren't actually that big of a thing. But I loved them. And I just found that they were such a fantastic way of consuming media. And I was trying to find, because I was so obsessed with education, I was trying to find education ones that would do what I wanted them to do, which is go really deep into education theory and practice and make it really practical for teachers. And I honestly couldn't find anything. I just couldn't find anything that I was interested in. I said, it seems like there's a real need for this, and I want to be able to listen to these conversations, so I guess I better have them myself. And so, yeah, I just started reaching out. I was originally supported by the Australian College of Educators, like Steve Dinham and Catherine Scott were particularly helpful originally. And it's called the Education Research Reading Room, because originally I would basically get a bunch of people together in the upstairs room of a pub or something like that, get the author to come along, someone like Steve Dinham or Catherine, and would have a chat and record it. And that's how it started. But then over time, it got harder and harder to arrange lots of people to come together. I started doing more recordings all online. And to be honest, I started to want to have more control over the kind of narrative of the interview myself. And so now it's pretty much just me recording.
Tell me more about that, Ollie. Was it your own personal reasoning to lead it, or was it a professional mindset around pedagogical practice?
I think I'm a bit of a natural interviewer. One of my prior partners referred to our first date as her interview, in fact. So I just kind of like to get deep and ask lots of questions and really get to the bottom of things. And so I think that I would often, start to head down a route with some questions and feel like I was getting to some real concrete answers that were really important for time poor educators. And then if I was in a group, I'd have like someone else would put their hand up and ask a question that I would feel wouldn't be as relevant to the listeners as perhaps something that I had in mind. I may be wrong about that, but that's the kind of feeling I had. And so I thought maybe it will work, maybe at least be easier for me to run these myself. And so that's what we did.
So let's fast forward through that ERRR podcast, which is still going strong. You're up to over episode 100.
I'm recording 101 this afternoon.
Fantastic. So who's your 101st, if you're happy to share?
It's Alex Evans, actually. So he comes from Ted Rag, St. Luke's. So as you know, Tim, I was over in England earlier in the year on a bit of a StepLab trip. And one of the schools we visited was Ted Rag. Ted Rag St. Luke's, part of the Ted Rag Trust. And I was just so blown away by how well Alex was able to articulate how they've addressed so many of the challenges that schools face when they try to get a high quality coaching program up and running, that I thought, we've got to get this story out to more people. Also, Alex has actually just received a promotion to another school and a headship. And so I thought, let's capture this in time before it becomes far too busy. And the story is perhaps not, well, hopefully told as well, but maybe not told with as much experience, because the person taking over from him won't be Alex, who's kind of taken Ted Rag St. Luke's on that journey.
Take us back quickly, 2 or 3 that jump out at you over the journey, if you're happy to share.
Yeah. I mean, a pretty early one that was impactful and probably helped with the popularity of the podcast a lot was when I interviewed first in episode 17, Adrian Simpson, when he was critiquing the idea of a meta-analysis, and then moved on to John Hattie, where he kind of defended the meta-analysis. So essentially, Adrian Simpson was critiquing Hattie's work, and then Hattie came on and defended it. And I think the fact that I got a big name like John on, and particularly given that his work was kind of being challenged in that episode, that was really, really interesting. And I think it also gave me confidence as an interviewer to kind of have academic integrity and to learn how to challenge ideas in a respectful way, which is hopefully something I continue to do today. I mean, Dylan Williams being a big one. Lorraine Hammond was an important one because she's a very phenomenal educator in Australia. She's been very influential, and it was actually that podcast that has been said to have sparked the Catholic Education Canberra Goldman Catalyst project, which I know Sandhurst has learnt a lot from as well. So that was it's nice to be able to kind of trace the influence of a podcast and a single discussion into a project that impactful. I mean, Bill Rogers is always a classic. And then probably another one that really jumps out is my discussion. I've had 2, but probably the first one sticks out more, with Vivian Robinson, Reduce Change to Increase Improvement. And that's one that I recommend the most, because I think that it talks about the engage approach and how when we lead, we need to really engage with people's theories of action. That is kind of their core beliefs around how the world works if we want to move forwards in a sustainable way. And I think that's just an important lesson for so many people in so many contexts.
I need to throw in there as well, Ollie, that very influential was the ERRR podcast with the Grattan Institute, particularly the multi-school organisation. It's something that really was instrumental for our steering committee in the establishment of Magnify Sandhurst, as it's now named. And our time with Jordana and Amy following that, reading of the paper and sharing that across Sandhurst has been really significant. Tell us a bit more about that podcast with Jordana and Amy and the Grattan crew.
Yeah, well, shout out to the Grattan crew. I have so much respect for them and their phenomenal work. And I'm also incredibly happy to hear, and I'd heard it before, but it's great to have it reinforce the impact of that and the way it's kind of acted as a bit of a spark for Magnify as well. Because I think that multi-school organisations is something that we need to think a lot more carefully about in Australia and that we should be pushing towards. Because the more I've learnt about quality education, the more I've realised that it's a very, very challenging task for teachers working in isolation, and even schools working in isolation, to achieve the level of success that's possible in education by themselves. And so the MSO approach, I was really happy to hear about more from the Grattan team. I think has so much promise for us, which is why I'm so excited about what Sandhurst is doing at the moment.
Ollie, some of your written work, which book jumps out at you the most that are you most proud of? And really what led to the thinking behind it and the work that's come from it?
Yeah, I've now written 3 books. The first one I started, it was actually Tools for Teachers. Basically, about 5 years maybe 4 years into running the EAAA podcast, I thought, wow, there's so many amazing things I've learned. I'd love to share these with people. And so I just got to writing, and I ended up writing about 110,000 words, pretty much, about 95,000 of which I subsequently threw out. It's interesting, the process of writing. It can kind of take a while to find your voice and find your rhythm. So that's what I started writing. But then I actually put that writing project on hold because I got approached by John Catt Educational and Tom Sherrington to write a book on cognitive load theory. That was off the back of an interview I'd done with John Sweller, because obviously, Dylan Williams started 2017, I think it was, wrote Sweller's cognitive load theory is the most important thing for teachers to know. And I thought, I better find this out. So I actually jumped on a plane, flew up to Sydney and interviewed John Sweller and wrote kind of 9 blog posts. And so when John Catt was looking for someone to write on the topic of cognitive load theory, I guess I came to mind for Tom. And so yeah, I got stuck into that. I used some interesting software that I was kind of co-developing at the time. I'm not sure, I kind of ended up leaving that project, but it was kind of spaced repetition, incremental reading software that I found really interesting and helpful in that writing process. I mean, I'm proud of all the books for different reasons, but Cognitive Load Theory in Action is definitely the best-selling book that I've put together. I don't know exactly how many copies now, but probably 15,000 or something like that. And that has proved a very, very popular book. And I constantly have people come up to me and say how impactful it's been on their thinking and their understanding of how learning works and things like that. So that's a real point of pride for me. And I'm really happy. And I think that's the book where I really found my voice as a writer and realized that something I feel like I can do quite well is take complex things and explain them in simple ways that is then actionable for time poor teachers.
I was going to ask, so was Dylan William right?
I think it's absolutely crucial for teachers to know that one of the main constraints they're working with as educators is the limited working memory capacity of their students. And I also feel that the cognitive load lens, if you deeply understand it, is something that you can apply in so many different places, to writing, to training, to teaching, to communication in lots of fields, to advertising, whatever. It's just such a powerful framework. And most important, I don't know. I think advice like what's the most important always depends upon the prior knowledge of the learner anyway. So I'm not sure if I'd hazard to say something like that, but I do think it's crucial.
So you're doing this podcast, you're learning from so many great people. When did the StepLab opportunity present itself, if it did, and how did that come about?
Another interview that listeners might enjoy is my first discussion with Peps McRae. He's a wonderful guy and now a good friend and a very driven guy as well. He's really focused and conscious about living a good life and making the most of his time and so on. And so a project that he'd been involved with was StepLab. And when we started to become more friends and understand each other's work a bit more, he said, I think you should meet my other mate, Josh, who started this thing called StepLab, which I think is pretty cool. And I think you might be interested in it. And so I first had a couple of Zooms with Josh and kind of learned a little bit about StepLab. Got pretty excited because I saw it as solving quite a few challenges that I saw in professional learning that I'd been part of or been running myself. And then I jumped over to the UK, saw StepLab in action in a number of schools. That was in July, flew over again in September, traveled around with Josh a little bit, got more of a sense of StepLab and thought, wow, this is really something that I think Australia could benefit from. So yeah, that's how it got started.
Give us more of that StepLab story and the work that Josh led in the establishment of StepLabs.
Well, so StepLab started 7 or 8 years ago. It was when Josh, one of our co-founders, Ben is the other one, and Ben will come in a moment to the story. But he was promoted to the role of essentially Director of Teaching and Learning across the Oasis Trust in England, which is one of these multi-school organisations. And give or take a couple of schools, Oasis Trust is about the same size as CESL. So that's a nice parallel there as well. And so Josh said, okay, I'm meant to improve all the teachers and support them to improve student learning. What am I supposed to do? And so he dove into the research. He's a very well-read guy, and he became more well-read throughout this process. Basically, he came across instructional coaching and realized that instructional coaching was a form of professional development that could act as a wrapper for lots of the ingredients that make professional development really effective. And there's a whole heap of really robust research that shows that when instructional coaching is done well, it can improve teaching and student outcomes in a whole heap of contexts. So from that, Josh said, okay, let's start running instructional coaching in the Oasis Trust. He got started and very quickly ran into a whole heap of challenges. These are the kind of challenges that all schools and systems run into generally. And so he kind of started to solve those problems. Started to solve them first with pencils and papers, writing little booklets and guides for teachers, creating templates for coaches, creating, spreadsheets to track coaching and things like that. And then he was chatting with the head of IT at Oasis, or it was either Oasis or his school, Ben, and telling him about the project he was doing. And Ben said, "You're doing that with pencil and paper. You're crazy. Let me build you a website for that." And so Ben created the website, and Josh kept on working on their kind of education and coaching side of things. And they were giving it away to other schools who were coming to visit Oasis, seeing what great that work they were doing. And then eventually Josh said, hold on, I'm spending more time on this than I am on teaching. This is unsustainable unless we start charging for it. And that's how kind of StepLab was born.
And now, 7 or 8 years later, how far-reaching is StepLab? First of all, in England and the broader UK and across the globe.
In total, we're working with over 8,000 schools globally, and that's primarily in the UK. But we're working with a large number here in Australia. We've just kind of expanded to the US in a partnership with Zach Groschel, who's kind of leading the charge over there. There's a big partnership that's just starting up in Dubai. Lots of international schools in Thailand and across Asia more broadly, for example, are using StepLab. So yeah, we're really excited. I think we've just put out 5 ads for new staff members. So StepLab is really, really growing at quite a quick rate. But I think most importantly, we are really focused on kind of our core mandate, which is to help schools run really world-class professional development. And the hires we make are pretty much exclusively ex-teachers / ex-school leaders, and they're people highly committed to improving teaching learning. And it's at the point now where it's really exciting because the people applying, like the number of applications we're having for the jobs recently posted, Josh was telling me about it, and the people who are applying, they're a lot of the household names of educators in the UK where they're advertising these jobs. People are seeing the value and they're wanting to be part of it, and that just means that we've got more brains, more ideas, and more great resources to keep on improving.
Credit to all involved. Well done to the founders and the continuation of that work as it expands across the globe. You mentioned research that drives it and underpins that work. Ollie, could you just touch on 3 or 4 key points or key research pieces that really drive that work? And then also the evidence of impact so far for StepLab.
So the work that we most often refer to when we introduce instructional coaching and the StepLab approach is some research led by the Education Endowment Foundation, particularly by now Professor Sam Sims. Harry Fletcher-Wood and Josh Goodrich are also contributors to this research. The research isn't actually about coaching. It's actually a literature review of and kind of a meta-analysis looking at what does it take not just to do coaching, but actually to run professional learning for teachers effectively. And what Sam Sims and colleagues did was they basically looked at a whole heap of industries and they said, what does it take to improve learners more generally and professionals more generally? And what they came up with was they said it's actually not the form of professional learning. We might argue that in education, lesson study is a really effective approach, a Japanese approach where people study lessons and improve them together, or maybe it's instructional coaching, or maybe it's teacher learning communities, which has been very popular in Victoria the last few years. But Sam Sims and colleagues found it's not actually these forms, it's actually these things called mechanisms, or some might say active ingredients. And so when we are trying to help teachers improve, what we need to do is consider things like One mechanism is, have we managed cognitive load? Have we not overwhelmed them? Another one might be, what social support have we included? Have we provided enough ongoing support for people? Have we provided clear models? Have we provided opportunities for rehearsal? I won't go through all of them, but there are 14 mechanisms that Sims and colleagues uncovered. And crucially, in line with these mechanisms, they also found that the mechanisms fit into 4 broad categories. And we need at least one mechanism from each category for professional learning to be effective. And these 4 categories are: the first thing professional learning needs to do is it must build knowledge. If teachers don't know anything new, then they're not going to be able to enact anything differently because they have no new knowledge. The second thing is that we need to motivate those teachers, because if they know something new but they don't want to change anything, then no change is going to happen again. The third thing we need to do is develop teaching techniques. So that's moving from more theoretical knowledge to concretely knowing how to change their classroom practice. And the fourth thing we need to do is support them to embed practice, so that these changes aren't just a flash in the pan. So this is the most powerful piece of research that we've come across, and it's really supported us to refine the StepLab model, and we've built a whole model around this research. So if people are keen to find out more about this, there's a paper or a blog, actually, The Science Behind StepLab, how it includes all 4 mechanisms of effective professional development. It's by Rachel Ball and myself. And if people want to go into some of the research that Josh in particular reviewed when he was deciding on instructional coaching, the StepLab white paper provides links to, I think it's a couple of 100 academic papers supporting the kind of work that we do at StepLab.
So pleased that you touched on the 14 mechanisms, because they're something that have really stood out for our leaders, principals and learning leaders, in some work we've already done with the StepLab team in term 1. And the levers that they pull for the mind as our staff have worked through this to go, oh, that fits there or that fits there. I can see this making sense. And that's prior to any of the formal instructional coach training commencing. So really pleased that you touched on that. Ollie, do you mind just touching on the evidence of the impact so far? I've read a paper recently that was from one of your trusts regarding the impact around teacher retention and some other key aspects of staff performance and outcomes for students. Can you just drill into some of that for us?
Some content that kind of comes off the top of my head, and this is because it's fresh. One of the great things that when a school runs really effective professional development, it helps teachers stay motivated and engaged and helps them want to stay. So if we look at the example of the TED-RAG St Luke's in particular, and this is borne out more broadly across the TED-RAG Trust, and I know we sent you some data on this a week or so ago, but I don't have those specific numbers on the top of my head. But I can tell you about TED-RAG St Luke's. When we visited in January, they said they're a secondary school of over 900 students, upwards of 80 teachers, and last year they had no teachers leave. And that is in stark contrast to previous years, particularly before they started their coaching. And so they've now built their support networks for teachers up to such a point that teachers are so happy, content, that they're happy to stay. So some other interesting research is that we've collaborated with TeacherTapp, which is the UK's largest survey organisation for teachers. Basically, TeacherTapp's just an app that teachers download. Every now and then, at the end of the day or the end of the week, they'll get a little ping that asks them a question. And when they answer that question, they get to see the results, the aggregated results for all the other teachers across the country who have answered that question already that day. It's a really lovely idea. TeacherTapp has asked a few questions about professional learning and contentment with it across schools in the UK. And one is, to what extent do you agree with this statement? PD improves my teaching. And the percentage of teachers across the UK who agree with that statement or strongly agree with that statement is 34%. So you've only got 34% of teachers who are saying, PD improves my teaching, which is kind of sad, I guess. In StepLab schools, that's 88%. Similarly, another question, the feedback I receive helps me improve. Nationally across the UK, the percentage of teachers who agree or strongly agree with that statement, feedback I receive helps me improve, is 40%. StepLab schools, it's 83%. So the perception of teachers in schools that are doing instructional coaching through StepLab and running PD more broadly is that they are improving. And we find this incredibly heartening.
Ollie, do you mind just filling us in and helping the listeners understand more around instructional coaching, the StepLab platform, and you just mentioned additional professional learning as well, in terms of what are our teachers in Sandhurst getting? If you're a teacher in one of our schools or a parent who sends your loved one along to one of our schools, what are they going to experience? What is that going to look like?
So StepLab probably started more focused just on instructional coaching, but over time we've realized that coaching works best if it sits within a broader system of support for teachers and their improvement. When we work with schools, we want to help schools firstly run effective professional learning for their staff around teaching techniques. That's kind of two key things. The first is help the teachers have insights around those teaching techniques, really understand what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, and how the techniques we're sharing with them are going to improve student learning. And then we want to help them understand the what as well. We want to give them practical strategies and give them opportunities to practice those strategies. So we would always, when we work with schools, we always recommend that they have pedagogical foci or a focus for a limited period of time. Might be something like entry routines, attention signals, effective questioning, something like that. And then they use two particular mechanisms to support them. One is drop-ins, which is short, sharp visits to each other's classrooms to support each other in implementing the practice. And the other is coaching, which is a slightly more involved approach involving quality models and observation, rehearsal, and forward planning to ensure you know exactly how you're going to change your practice next lesson. So that's generally what when I talk about like an effective approach to PD, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that whole picture that starts with, instruction on a new technique and reflection upon it, carrying it out in the classroom with support, varying levels thereof, and then reflection upon that and kind of a cyclical approach to that. So that's kind of what we're doing in Sandhurst as well.
Thanks, Ollie. A terrific understanding regarding what's coming up with the work in StepLab. I think it was Paul Bissonella, a colleague of mine, I think reached out first and foremost to someone at StepLab, perhaps yourself, and lined up a conversation. At that point in time, there was the notion that we've got a lot of theory here from some of our partners. We've got the operation in terms of curriculum delivery, and we really saw a need to help join those dots. The connection in terms of all of the reason that you've just provided to be able to understand what high quality delivery of curriculum material is one thing, but to be able to do it is another. So that instructional approach. So I think it was Paul contacted you. Do you want to just pick up from there in terms of the establishment of the partnership with Sandhurst?
I guess the first thing I was really excited about when chatting with Sandhurst was how focused you'd already been in bringing the science of learning to your schools and to your students. And a lot of the partnerships that you'd set up were really encouraging to us and showed us that you were serious about that. I guess what we felt we could bring, and this is kind of the way I articulated it to Paul, and I think you might have been at that meeting as well, Tim, a few others as well, was that for overarching change, we need to impact the schools and the teachers and the students within Sandhurst at a number of levels. So one level is kind of theory. This is teachers, and this relates to what I was just talking about in StepLab model more broadly. Theory, what do teachers need to know about how learning happens and how teachers can facilitate that so that they can improve? So that's the first thing. The next thing is techniques. So we've got that theory. Techniques is practically what are you doing in the classroom? And another level is curriculum, which is what are the concrete skills, knowledge that you're communicating to students and hoping that they master. So within Sandhurst, I could see when we kind of started to discuss originally that you'd already thought pretty deeply about the kind of theory that you wanted your teachers to really master and to the knowledge you wanted to build on. And that's, for example, a lot of the work with Jared Cooney-Horvath. A lot of work had been done around curriculum already with, for example, OCA and Multilit. But perhaps techniques that's kind of the glue that sticks the theory to the curriculum is an area where StepLab could come in and help. And so I guess that's that role that we see StepLab playing within Magnify more broadly. It's acting as that glue between the theory and the curriculum and providing teachers with concrete techniques, a way to improve them and a way to track them and see that improvement over time through both our approach and our platform.
I think it was a follow-up meeting that we sat in a meeting room. There was about 6 or 7 from the steering committee, and there were about 8 people online from StepLab that had dialed in from pretty well all over the world to give us a greater in-depth understanding around StepLab work, the platform, the evidence of the impact. And we were overwhelmed by the scope of the work. And it had come off the back of the multi-school organisation discussion and that research piece that was on sweet spot between 15 and 100 schools. And we identified that as being us. So we really saw that Ollie could bring to us a product in Australia that had been tried and tested in a broad sense under a multi-school organisation model in England. And that was what really appealed to us. We also loved that quite granular codification of the best practice down to how something is delivered in a classroom. So under those core steps that are identified through the platform, Ollie, we're really, really excited about our journey forward. Do you want to just give us a bit of an update as to where it currently sits and our rollout from here?
Sure. One thing I might add before that is that something else I'm excited about, you mentioned granularity there, is the way that we're increasingly kind of codifying these kind of change processes as well. So I'd say that StepLab really started out, and Josh's work really started out codifying good teaching practice and making that clear for teachers. But as we've had the opportunity to work with larger organizations, multi-school organizations and so on, we're actually able to see patterns of what it takes to make this kind of work happen at scale. And so that's kind of some of what you were alluding to then in relation to that meeting, but that's something that I'm particularly excited about as well. And it's great to be able to bring some of that work to fruition in Sandhurst as well. So what we're doing at the moment in Sandhurst, basically we're training some coaches. So we've got a first cohort, about 120 teachers and leaders from across Sandhurst. Currently, we've had a launch webinar. There's a follow-up meeting, kind of small group call meeting coming up very soon. And they're out exploring the StepLab drop-in feature, which is basically a way to pop into other team members' classes, provide a bit of acknowledgement of really fantastic practice that's going on in relation to a specific focus of practice, and that focus will shift and change over time and also be adaptive. And then we come together and use that as a way to inform, what could be some focus areas in your school and your context for improving teaching. In August, we're going to be doing a 2-day intensive of instructional coaching training with those 120 cohort 1 coaches. And that training mirrors basically a year-long course that we run called the Certificate in Coaching Leadership. And Tim, you and a bunch of other of the Sandhurst team members recently came in March to that 2-day training. So you've seen exactly what it looks like. And we're really excited to bring that specifically to Sandhurst. It's going to be a big couple of days with 120 people, but it should be really, really good. And hopefully they'll leave that feeling confident and competent to start the coaching journey. They'll then go back to their contexts. They'll start a bit of coaching with people who are particularly keen to get stuck in. Then we'll run a second cohort through a similar training program. And I think probably the main thing I want to emphasize out of this is how exciting it is for a project like Magnify to be taking such a dedicated approach to succession planning. Because what this is going to do is, by training up these coaches, we're actually together enabling each school to take ownership for this change journey and to sustain the changes that are made in this kind of sprint with all this hard work, with all these partner organizations, for that work to be sustained over the long term, because you're not going to be relying on kind of external coaches coming in. We're actually skilling up those in school. So that's what I'm probably most excited about in terms of that.
Thanks, Ollie. We are starting with some consistency in terms of our core strand based on some learning and our recent intensive in Melbourne. It probably made that clearer for us again around the need for our coaches as we commence this together to really work together in solidarity. So the core strand that we've chosen is optimizing communication and giving clear explanations is our goal. And that will be the focus for our first group of coaches. And then over the next few years, we've got a pretty lofty goal and we've mapped it. I've actually come from a meeting today where it's reasonably well mapped over the next 2.5 years to ensure that all Sandhurst staff will undertake training and be coached under this model, utilising our StepLab platform. So we're really excited by the partnership, and we know that it will be an essential glue in helping us on our journey. Ollie, you've now worked with all of our school principals and some staff in the office. Is there anything in particular that struck you about Sandhurst?
Yeah, so there's a person in Australia who does a lot of work in curriculum. His name's Ben Jensen, and he runs an organisation called Learning First. I'm coming around to answer your question in a roundabout way, Tim. Ben Jensen has worked with a lot of systems to promote change. This is from Singapore to Canada and all over the world. I was lucky enough to have a chat with Ben, and I said, Ben, across all these systems, what's the common thing in the ones that work? What does it actually take for a system to positively change? And he said, Ollie, honestly, it's one thing. It's a group of smart people who are really committed. If you have a group of smart people who are really committed, the change will happen. And so in our initial meetings, Tim, with yourself, Kate, Paul, and the rest of the team, I had this sense that you were a group of really smart people who are really committed and really focused on this Magnify project. And I can tell from the times you guys send me emails and the times you call me and the times that I know you're working and how hard you're working, how committed you are. And I know from our conversations and how quickly you've all been able to pick up all the training that we've laid down, all the communications, and how well you've apprehended the really high level concepts that have taken myself and the rest of the StepLab team years to kind of get our heads around, how quickly you've picked up on that. So we are just so excited to be working with a really smart and really committed team. And I personally feel like that's a key ingredient to making Magnify work. So yeah, we're just super excited about that.
Flattering words, Ollie. I know that extends to our principals and their leadership that you've seen. You spent a day with them in Bendigo earlier this year.
100%.
How did you find that day?
I include the principals in that analysis. And, I've run a lot of trainings for large groups and groups of principals as well. And I haven't come across another group of principals who were as engaged in a change initiative as so. The committed and smart group continues all the way down, and I look forward to the August training with our first cohort, which I have no doubt will be exactly the same, and also in a couple of weeks when Roy and I have the chance to chat with your team more broadly through the 3 training days we've got set out.
Ollie, it's a catch cry as we finish Magnify Matters each episode. We're going to go to the same question for our guest, and it's based on everything we've discussed today. What matters most?
One of the other things that we talked about when we originally started talking about the possibility of a partnership between StepLab and CSL was some of the things that StepLab can bring, which are some alignment around what makes really good teaching, those kind of techniques that we were talking about earlier. Oversight, which enables, teachers to know what's happening in their own classrooms, principals to know what's happening in the classroom with their teachers, and also head office to kind of have a bit more oversight and fine-grained understanding of what's happening in schools. But also empowerment, and that idea of empowerment harks back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of I'm so excited that Magnify is taking succession planning so seriously and really ensuring that we're building the skills within the diocese to carry out this change program long term. So for me, that third point is all that point about empowerment is what I think matters the most, because that relates back to the work of Vivian Robinson, which I alluded to as well. If teachers and school leaders and students and parents don't feel like this change initiative is theirs, then we can't be successful. So we need to be sure and be confident that what's being led in many ways by head office is really being owned by schools, school leaders and teachers. So that empowerment piece, I think, is paramount. I'm really excited about the way that I feel like StepLab can contribute to that as well. And I think that we are heading in the right direction, and we are getting it right from the conversations and interactions I've had from people in the team and from those across Sandhurst more broadly. So that'd be my answer, Tim. What matters most is empowerment.
Thanks, Ollie. As we seek to train all of our teachers, it's a really important message to take from this around the guiding lights again of solidarity to subsidiarity. And a key aspect of subsidiarity is empowerment. And we know that this has been a considerable change process so far, and we know that we need to continue to ensure that all are involved and own the work together. Ollie, thanks so much for your time today on Magnify Matters. All the best with episode number 101. And we know that you'll be a regular contributor to this podcast and many other platforms as we make our way forward as a partner of Magnify Sandhurst. So thanks again.
That's it for this episode of Magnify Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about great teaching and learning. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we magnify what truly matters.